Michael Jordan gets a fan letter from death row. His response shocks the inmate's family. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Marcus Smith sat on his narrow cot in the small cell, the harsh fluorescent light flickering overhead. His world was confined to the cold concrete walls of the federal penitentiary, a place where time felt infinite, and his past mistakes loomed over him like an ever-present shadow. But today, Marcus was holding something different, an envelope. He stared at it for a moment, the bold, black letters on the front catching his attention. Michael Jordan. The name alone brought back a flood of memories, the kind that felt like a distant dream now. He had been a fan of Michael Jordan since his childhood, when basketball had been the escape from a rough life. He remembered the sound of sneakers squeaking on hardwood floors, the rush of adrenaline as Jordan soared through the air, delivering impossible dunks. Michael Jordan had been a symbol of greatness, of what was possible even in the face of overwhelming odds. For Marcus, the love of basketball had always been there. It was a passion that had carried him through many tough times, and when his life had taken a turn for the worse, it was one of the few things that kept him grounded. But now, in the isolation of his prison cell, he had come to realize something that changed everything. Michael Jordan was not just a hero for his athleticism, he was a symbol of perseverance, strength, and defying the odds. Marcus had spent years reflecting on his past, on the choices that led him to this point in his life. He was no longer the young man who had idolized Jordan from a distance, he was a convicted felon on death row. His life, as he knew it, was nearing its end. Still, Marcus couldn't help but hold on to one final hope. A thought had crept into his mind, a simple idea. What if he could somehow reach out to the person who had meant so much to him, the man whose career had taught him to fight, to never give up? What if he could express his gratitude to Michael Jordan for everything he had unknowingly done for him? After all, what did he have to lose? The letter that Marcus wrote wasn't a request for sympathy, nor was it a plea for help. It was a simple message, a message of thanks. He wrote about how Michael's career had given him strength during the darkest moments of his life. He recalled the first time he saw Jordan play, how he had been mesmerized by his skill and determination. But it wasn't just the basketball that inspired Marcus. It was the way Jordan seemed to embody resilience in every game, every play. In a life filled with hardship, Michael Jordan had been his hero, not just for what he did on the court, but for what he stood for. He wrote about how, despite the mistakes he had made, he still believed in the idea of redemption. Even in the face of the end of his life, Marcus wanted Michael to know that his legacy had shaped the man he was today. It was a letter that came from the heart, and as Marcus finished writing, he folded it carefully and sealed it in an envelope. He addressed it to Michael Jordan's office in Chicago, unsure if it would ever make it to him, but hoping that somehow, his words would find their way to the man who had unknowingly given him hope. The letter sat on Marcus's desk for a few days before he finally decided to send it. He wasn't expecting anything in return. What he had done was a long shot, a final attempt at reaching out from the confines of his prison cell. But as the letter was mailed off, Marcus felt a sense of peace. He had said what he needed to say, and in a way, that was enough. He had written to his hero, to the man who had shown him that greatness wasn't just about winning, it was about overcoming adversity, about fighting against all odds. It was months before Marcus heard anything in return. He had long since pushed the letter to the back of his mind, buried under the weight of the realities of his life. But then, one day, a guard brought him an envelope, this one addressed to him, in a familiar handwriting. Marcus couldn't believe it. He tore open the letter and read the words, barely able to comprehend the reality of what was happening. Michael Jordan had written back. The letter was short but powerful. In it, Michael thanked Marcus for his kind words and expressed his admiration for the strength it took to face adversity head-on. He acknowledged Marcus's past mistakes but reminded him that it was never too late to change, never too late to find redemption. Michael wrote that he believed people had the capacity to grow, to better themselves, no matter where they started from or what they had done in the past. Marcus read the letter over and over again, his eyes welling up with tears. The simple words, the acknowledgement from someone he had admired for so long, had created a sense of hope he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just a letter, it was a lifeline, a reminder that even in his darkest moments, he could find a way forward. Michael Jordan, the man who had inspired him all those years ago, had offered him something more valuable than he could have ever imagined, the belief that it wasn't too late for change. The news of the letter began to spread quickly. Rachel Green, Marcus's lawyer, was the first to hear about it. She had watched Marcus over the years, seen the toll his circumstances had taken on him, and knew how much this response meant. But even she was stunned by the gravity of the moment. The letter from Michael Jordan wasn't just a piece of correspondence, it was a sign that there was still hope for Marcus, still a chance for him to change the narrative of his life. Rachel began to consider the possibilities that this letter opened up. She saw it as more than just a personal victory for Marcus, it was a potential turning point in his case. Rachel knew that the response from Michael could be used in ways that went beyond mere emotional support. She began to think about how the letter could play a part in Marcus's legal battle. Could it show that Marcus had made a real effort to change? Could it prove that even in the final moments of his life, he was attempting to redeem himself? The letter became a symbol of that very possibility, a thread of hope woven into an otherwise bleak situation. Meanwhile, as the story of the letter made its way through the prison, other inmates took notice. Many had been skeptical of Marcus's attempts to find redemption, seeing his past actions as irreparable. But the letter from Michael Jordan began to shift the perception. For the first time, Marcus was seen not just as a criminal, but as a man who had the courage to reach out and seek something greater than himself. His story, once a cautionary tale, began to inspire others in the prison, and whispers of redemption spread through the halls. The story of Marcus Smith and his letter to Michael Jordan wasn't just about basketball. It was about the power of belief, the capacity for change, and the way a single gesture, no matter how small, could impact someone's life. Michael Jordan had never anticipated the consequences of his response. But as Marcus began to change, as his perspective shifted, he realized that the letter had ignited something much bigger than himself. It had sparked hope, not only in Marcus, but in those around him. As the months wore on, Marcus began to approach each day with a new sense of purpose. He knew his past could never be erased, but the letter from Michael Jordan had given him the strength to face it, to move forward with the belief that he could change. And in the process, he began to show others that it was possible to rise above your past, to find redemption, and to live a life that honored the lessons learned along the way. Rachel Green couldn't believe what she was holding in her hands. The letter, signed by Michael Jordan himself, had arrived on her desk in the most unexpected way. When she had first read Marcus's heartfelt plea to the basketball legend, she had never imagined that it would lead to such a response. Rachel had known Marcus for years, she had represented him in the courtroom, through all his appeals and struggles. She had witnessed the toll his life in prison had taken on him, how the years of confinement and isolation had shaped a man who had long ago given up on the idea of redemption. But now, as she read the words of a global icon offering hope to her client, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. It was something she knew could change everything. The letter was simple, yet powerful. Michael Jordan acknowledged Marcus's mistakes, yes, but he also focused on his potential for growth. Michael spoke about the importance of resilience, of not letting the past define the future. The words he had written resonated deeply, not just with Marcus but with Rachel as well. For years, Rachel had fought for Marcus's chance at redemption, constantly battling against the legal system and his own sense of guilt. But this letter from Michael Jordan, it was more than just a response from a celebrity. It was a lifeline. A reminder that even those who had made irreversible mistakes could find a way forward. Marcus had spent years in prison, isolated and separated from the world. His past was a weight he carried with him every day. He had made mistakes, some that would cost him his freedom forever, and the years on death row had been a constant reminder of his regrets. When he had written to Michael Jordan, he hadn't expected much. A letter from the great MJ himself seemed like an impossible dream, one that wasn't meant to come true. But when the response arrived, it became clear that something had shifted. The words Michael had written had sparked a change in Marcus, and Rachel could see that almost immediately. In the days following the arrival of the letter, Rachel sat with Marcus in the prison's small, sterile visitation room. His eyes, usually distant and hard, were full of emotion as he clutched the letter in his hands. Marcus didn't say much. His quiet demeanor spoke volumes. He had been expecting the world to ignore him, but Michael Jordan's words had shattered that expectation. For the first time in a long while, Marcus saw himself in a new light. "What do you think?" Rachel asked gently, sitting across from him. Marcus's fingers traced the edges of the letter. "I never thought this would happen," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But now, I don't know. I feel like maybe I've got a chance. Like I'm not just a lost cause." Rachel nodded, understanding the gravity of what he was feeling. She had spent years fighting for his release, but this was something different. This letter wasn't just about changing the course of Marcus's life in the courtroom, it was about the way Marcus saw himself. Michael Jordan, a figure who had been larger than life for so many, had seen Marcus not as a criminal, but as a person capable of change. "That's the power of hope, Marcus," Rachel said. "It can change everything, even when you think there's nothing left." But it wasn't just Marcus who was impacted by the letter. As news of Michael Jordan's response spread through the prison, the other inmates began to take notice. Many of them had heard about Marcus's long-standing admiration for Michael, but no one had expected this kind of gesture from the basketball legend. Some prisoners, hardened by years of incarceration, dismissed it as a publicity stunt. Others, however, saw something different. They saw the potential for change. They saw that even in the most unlikely places, on death row, there could still be hope, redemption, and the possibility of transformation. The letter became a point of conversation, a topic that the men in the prison began to discuss. Some started to wonder if they too could change, if they too could find a way out of the despair they had been living in. For years, prison had been a place where dreams went to die, where the system had given up on many of them. But now, with Michael Jordan's words resonating through the hallways, they began to see that there might still be a chance for growth, a chance to become more than the mistakes they had made. Rachel had never seen Marcus so determined. She had always known he had potential, but she had never seen him fully embrace the idea of personal change. It wasn't just the letter that had inspired him, it was the fact that someone like Michael Jordan had taken the time to reach out. To acknowledge Marcus as more than just a prisoner, more than just a person defined by his past mistakes. It was a moment of validation that was rare, especially for someone who had spent years fighting to find redemption. In the days that followed, Marcus began to change his approach. He started taking responsibility for his actions in ways he hadn't before. He began to engage in prison programs that focused on rehabilitation, and he even began mentoring some of the younger inmates who were struggling to make sense of their own lives. His transformation wasn't immediate, change never is, but it was real. He was no longer the man he had been before receiving Michael's letter. There was a new sense of purpose in him, something that had been missing for years. Rachel noticed the shift, but she also saw the challenges ahead. Marcus's fate still hung in the balance. The legal system was a slow-moving beast, and while Michael Jordan's letter had brought a new perspective to the case, it wouldn't be enough to guarantee Marcus's release. Still, Rachel believed that the letter had done something even more important. It had given Marcus the strength to keep fighting for his future, and it had reignited a sense of hope that had been extinguished for so long. The fight for his life wasn't over, but the visit from Michael Jordan had made it feel possible. The emotional impact of Michael's letter spread beyond the prison walls. Marcus's family was shocked when they heard the news. For years, they had been fighting to support him, but it had often felt like an uphill battle. Now, with the letter from Michael Jordan in their hands, they had a renewed sense of hope. They knew that Marcus's redemption was a long road, but this letter felt like the first step on that journey. It was the first time in years that they saw a glimmer of the man they once knew, the man who had been full of potential, full of life, before his mistakes had trapped him in the prison system. For Marcus, the letter wasn't just a reminder of who he had been, but a blueprint for who he could become. It wasn't a simple message of forgiveness, it was a message of strength, of resilience, and the possibility that one could rise above their past. Michael Jordan had shown him that no matter where you were or what you had done, you could always choose to move forward. And as the days turned into weeks, Marcus knew that the letter wasn't just a part of his past. It had become a part of his future, a reminder that no matter how hard life had been, redemption wasn't out of reach. Michael Jordan's response had given him the power to believe in himself again, and that was something no one, not even the system, could take away. Marcus sat in the dimly lit visiting room, the letter from Michael Jordan resting on the table in front of him. His hands trembled slightly as he traced the words that had been written to him. This wasn't just a letter from a famous athlete, it was a letter from someone who had changed his life. For years, Marcus had been living in a world of self-imposed darkness, drowning in the mistakes of his past. But now, with Michael's words staring back at him, it felt like a light had pierced through that darkness. It wasn't just a letter, it was a lifeline. He had spent so many years feeling trapped in his own mind, replaying the moments that had led him to this place. Marcus had never been a criminal in his heart, but the actions of his younger self had placed him on a path he couldn't reverse. Yet, here he was, reading words that made him feel human again. It was the validation he hadn't realized he needed. Michael Jordan, his childhood hero, had seen him, had heard him, and had responded. For the first time in years, Marcus felt like he wasn't just a convict in a cell. He was someone who still had a chance. In the days that followed, Marcus found himself reflecting deeply on Michael's words. The letter wasn't filled with empty words of encouragement, it was a message of real hope, one that didn't gloss over Marcus's past but acknowledged it while also offering the possibility of change. Michael had not just written to him as a fan, but as someone who understood the power of resilience. He had spent his entire life facing immense pressure, overcoming challenges that few could understand, and yet he had remained steadfast. Michael's message had reminded Marcus that strength didn't just come from winning, it came from the will to rise, no matter how many times you fell. The psychological shift that followed was immediate. Marcus started to change the way he viewed his situation. He began to push away the anger and self-pity that had consumed him for so long. Every day felt like a new chance to prove that he wasn't defined by the worst parts of his life. He had made mistakes, but that didn't have to be the story he kept telling himself. The letter had planted a seed of hope that slowly began to grow. Rachel Green, his lawyer, noticed the change in him almost immediately. She had been working with Marcus for years, trying to find a way to reduce his sentence, to make some case for the man he had become. But it had always felt like an uphill battle. Marcus was a man burdened by his past, and the law didn't care much about the person he had become. But now, she saw a different man in front of her. There was something in his eyes that wasn't there before, a spark of determination, of belief in himself that had been dormant for too long. It was as if Michael's words had breathed new life into him, and Rachel knew that this could be the turning point they had been waiting for. She wasn't sure what Michael Jordan's letter would do for Marcus in the long run, but she knew that it had already done something profound. It had made Marcus realize that redemption wasn't just a pipe dream, it was a real possibility. Rachel knew that in the courtroom, action spoke louder than words. Marcus had spent years locked away, but the letter had begun a process of transformation that couldn't be ignored. She began working with him on the kind of rehabilitation programs that could show the court that Marcus was trying to make amends. She encouraged him to get involved in prison education, to take part in programs that helped others confront their pasts. If he was going to stand a chance, she knew, it would require more than just a letter, it would require evidence that he was changing, that he had learned from his mistakes and wanted to contribute positively. In the meantime, news of the letter from Michael Jordan began to spread. The story of a death row inmate receiving a personal response from one of the world's most famous athletes quickly caught the attention of the media. While some saw it as an unlikely friendship, others saw it as a moment of redemption. The letter had created a ripple effect that went beyond the prison walls. Marcus's story was now being shared on news outlets, in interviews, and across social media platforms. People were drawn to the story of a man who had reached out to his hero in the most unlikely of ways and had received a message that would alter the course of his life. But the media coverage was not without its complications. Many saw the story as an example of the power of celebrity, but it also raised uncomfortable questions about the justice system. Was Marcus really deserving of the chance he was getting, or was his situation just another example of a broken system that gave too much weight to the words of the famous? Some argued that the letter from Michael Jordan had no place in the legal proceedings, that it shouldn't be used as evidence of Marcus's rehabilitation. But others saw it as an act of genuine kindness, one that gave Marcus a glimpse of the human side of the system, a side that had often been denied to him. As the media frenzy grew, Marcus remained focused on his personal transformation. He knew that the attention surrounding Michael's letter wasn't going to change the facts of his case. It wasn't going to erase his crimes or undo the damage he had done. But it had given him a sense of purpose, something he had been lacking for so long. He began to see his life in a new light, not as a prisoner doomed to spend his final years locked away, but as a man who had been given a second chance. It wasn't about freedom in the traditional sense, it was about the freedom to choose who he wanted to be moving forward. Meanwhile, Michael Jordan, who had written the letter with no expectation of fanfare, was now dealing with the fallout. He had never imagined that his words would spark such a wave of media attention. For Michael, the letter had simply been a personal response to a fan who had reached out to him in a time of need. He had written the letter because he believed in second chances, in the possibility of growth, and in the power of personal redemption. But as the story began to spread, Michael realized that his gesture had become something much bigger. It had become a symbol of hope, not just for Marcus, but for others who had made mistakes and believed that they were beyond redemption. In the face of growing media scrutiny, Michael remained quiet. He knew that the public's perception of his actions was now out of his control, but he also knew that he had done the right thing. His letter to Marcus had been a reflection of his own values he had carried with him throughout his career. It wasn't about being a hero, it was about doing the right thing when given the opportunity. As Marcus worked to change his life, as Rachel fought to reduce his sentence, and as the world continued to discuss the implications of Michael's letter, one thing remained clear: redemption was possible, even for those who had fallen the furthest. Marcus had been given a chance, and now it was up to him to prove that he could rise above his past and live a life that honored the gift he had been given. Whether he received a second chance in the eyes of the law, only time would tell. But one thing was certain: the letter from Michael Jordan had ignited a spark in him that would never go out. As the days passed, Marcus began to notice a shift within himself that went beyond the immediate emotional impact of Michael Jordan's letter. At first, it had been just a glimmer of hope, something to hold on to when everything seemed lost. But now, as he spent more time reflecting on the words Michael had written, that hope started to solidify into something more real, more tangible. Michael had acknowledged the depths of his mistakes but had also challenged him to look beyond them, to envision a future where redemption wasn't just a distant possibility, but an active goal. The small changes in Marcus were subtle but undeniable. He began attending more rehabilitation programs, some that he had previously dismissed as meaningless. He'd always thought of himself as beyond saving, beyond help, someone who had been written off by society long ago. But now, Michael's letter had given him a new lens through which to view his situation. He wasn't just a prisoner, he was a man with a future that he could still shape, regardless of how much time was left for him. For the first time, he felt that he could do something with that time, something meaningful. Rachel Green watched these changes with cautious optimism. She had represented Marcus for years, but this was the first time she had seen him engage with his future in such a profound way. Her job had always been to fight for him in court, to argue his case for leniency, to highlight the possibility of reform. But she had never been able to make Marcus believe in the change she saw in him. Now, with Michael's letter, she saw that spark of belief in his eyes, and it made her wonder if this was the turning point they had been waiting for. Despite the progress Marcus was making, Rachel knew the battle wasn't over. There was still the matter of the legal case, and the letter alone wouldn't change the outcome. The court system wasn't one to be swayed by sentiment or a single letter from a public figure. But what Michael's letter had done was give them a new avenue, a personal story of transformation that they could now use in Marcus's defense. Rachel knew it wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, she had a real sense of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, Marcus could get another chance. Marcus's transformation didn't go unnoticed by the other inmates either. He had always been a quiet presence in the prison, a man who kept to himself and kept his head down. But now, he was more engaged. He had started speaking to the younger inmates, sharing his story, encouraging them to think beyond their mistakes. Many of them had heard about the letter from Michael Jordan, and some began asking him about it. They too saw something in Marcus now that they hadn't before, a sense of possibility. One inmate, Carl, had been in prison for a similar length of time and had made peace with his fate. When he first heard that Marcus had received a letter from Michael Jordan, he was skeptical. "Ain't no way that letter's gonna change your life, man," Carl had said one afternoon while they were working in the prison yard. "You're still here, just like me, just like all of us." But as the days went on, Carl noticed something different in Marcus. He wasn't the same man who had walked into the yard every day with his head down. Now, Marcus stood a little taller. He spoke with more confidence, and the way he interacted with the other inmates was different. He was reaching out, helping others see that there was more to life than the mistakes they had made. Slowly, Carl began to understand the shift in Marcus. It wasn't about a letter from Michael Jordan, it was about the hope that letter represented. The letter had sparked something that even Carl couldn't deny. Maybe redemption wasn't as far away as he had once believed. While Marcus worked to rebuild his sense of self, Rachel continued to fight for him in the courtroom. She had begun gathering evidence of his progress, highlighting the ways in which he was engaging in rehabilitation programs and showing signs of personal growth. The media had latched onto the story of Marcus's letter from Michael Jordan, and some saw it as an example of the power of celebrities to change lives. Others saw it as a gimmick, just another story of a celebrity intervening in a case for the sake of publicity. But Rachel knew the truth. The letter wasn't just a feel-good moment. It had served as the catalyst for a real transformation, one that was now undeniable. Rachel spent hours crafting her arguments, presenting Marcus's case in a way that showed his willingness to change. She knew that if she was going to win this case, she would need to do more than just argue the legal points. She had to show the court that Marcus was not the same man he had been when he first entered the prison system. The letter from Michael Jordan wasn't a silver bullet, but it had given her something tangible to work with. It had demonstrated that Marcus was capable of introspection, capable of growth, and capable of change. Meanwhile, the ripple effect of Michael's letter reached beyond Marcus's immediate circle. The media began to focus on the larger issue. Could a simple letter from a public figure really change a person's life? Some commentators dismissed it as an act of celebrity charity. Others saw it as a sign that the justice system needed to reconsider how it handled inmates who showed signs of reform. Michael Jordan's role in the story became an ethical debate. Was it right for someone of his stature to intervene in such a personal and high-stakes situation? Did his influence make the legal system more forgiving, or was it simply an example of kindness in a world that often lacked it? Despite the controversy, Marcus stayed focused on his own path. He had spent so much of his life in the shadows, afraid to confront the consequences of his actions. But now, he was taking responsibility for them in a way he had never done before. He realized that he wasn't just asking for a second chance, he was fighting to prove that he had the strength to live a life worthy of it. The court date loomed ahead, and Rachel knew that this would be the moment where everything came together. The legal battle was far from over, and the stakes were incredibly high. But for the first time, Rachel saw that Marcus was no longer just a man caught in the system. He was someone who had the potential to change, to rewrite the narrative of his life. And as she prepared for the next steps in his case, she couldn't help but feel that the journey Marcus had embarked on, sparked by a letter from Michael Jordan, was more than just a legal matter. It was a story of transformation, of hope, and the kind of redemption that had always seemed out of reach. The days leading up to Marcus's court hearing were filled with a quiet tension. Inside the prison, life continued as usual, but Marcus felt like everything had changed. He wasn't the same man who had entered those steel gates years ago. His transformation wasn't just about following rehabilitation programs or reading more books, it was deeper. It was about his soul, about his willingness to confront the mistakes he had made and accept the possibility that he could be more than just the sum of those mistakes. And it all began with that one letter. Rachel worked tirelessly, gathering more evidence, drafting arguments, and preparing for the day when she would stand before the judge and plead Marcus's case. She knew the letter from Michael Jordan could be powerful in the courtroom, but it wasn't a silver bullet. It couldn't undo the crimes Marcus had committed. It couldn't erase the past. What it could do, however, was demonstrate something that had been missing from his legal case for years, a glimpse of Marcus's potential for change. For the first time, she saw in him not just a client, but a man who could find redemption in his own way. As Rachel sat in her office one evening, reviewing her notes, the weight of the case settled in. She had seen Marcus struggle with his demons for years, had watched him retreat inward when he thought there was no hope. But now, as the trial date loomed closer, she couldn't help but feel that something greater was at play. Marcus had always been a good man, deep down. He just needed the opportunity to prove it, and somehow, against all odds, Michael Jordan had given him that chance. It was a long shot, but Rachel believed in Marcus. She believed that he deserved a chance to show the world the man he was becoming. Marcus, for his part, was ready. He had taken full responsibility for his actions, no longer blaming anyone else for the life he had lived. He had spent years inside the walls of that prison, but in his mind, he was already fighting for something beyond mere survival. He was fighting for the possibility of redemption, for the chance to prove that he could still make a difference in the world. It was a fight he had never truly engaged in before, but now, with Michael's letter, it felt like the first real battle he could win. In the days leading up to the trial, Marcus began to speak more openly with other inmates. He had always been a man of few words, keeping to himself for most of his time in prison. But now, he was reaching out, telling his story, and sharing his hopes for the future. In a place where hope often seemed scarce, his newfound optimism became contagious. Others began to look at Marcus differently. The hardened men who had once written him off now saw the quiet strength in his actions. They saw a man who had decided to rise above his past, to confront it head-on and move forward. Carl, the older inmate who had initially doubted Marcus's transformation, watched him closely. Marcus had been someone Carl respected, but not someone he believed could change. Still, over the past few months, Carl had seen Marcus take on a new role in the prison, one that didn't involve running with the crowd or keeping his head down. He was becoming a mentor, offering advice, encouragement, and sharing his journey. It wasn't just about the letter anymore. It was about Marcus's heart, his desire to leave something behind that wasn't defined by violence or regret. Carl was amazed at the change. The courtroom hearing was finally set. Rachel and Marcus walked into the courtroom together, the weight of the world on their shoulders. Marcus hadn't been in a courtroom for years, but this time, he wasn't the same man who had entered the system all those years ago. He had come to terms with his past, with the man he had been, and he was determined to stand before the judge and show him that the man he had become was worth saving. The media was present, of course, eager to capture any angle they could find in this unusual case. Michael Jordan's involvement had turned Marcus's story into something bigger than a typical trial. People wanted to know how the letter had changed him, whether it had truly made a difference in his life. But for Marcus, the eyes of the world didn't matter. What mattered was this moment, the chance to prove that he had the strength to change, to grow, and to be better. As the trial began, Rachel delivered her opening statement. She didn't focus on Michael's letter at first. Instead, she talked about Marcus's transformation, how, over the last few months, he had worked hard to confront the darkest parts of his past and rebuild himself. She spoke about the rehabilitation programs he had completed, the mentorship he had provided to younger inmates, and the personal growth he had undergone. She didn't ask for sympathy, but for an opportunity for Marcus to prove that he was capable of becoming someone who could contribute to society, not just a man marked by his mistakes. When it was Marcus's turn to speak, he stood before the judge in the courtroom, his hands trembling slightly. But his voice was steady as he began to tell his story. He spoke about his life before prison, the choices that led him down a path of crime, and the consequences he had faced for those choices. He didn't sugarcoat his past or try to make excuses. But he also spoke about the man he was becoming. He talked about Michael's letter and how it had given him a new sense of purpose. For the first time in years, Marcus felt like someone believed in him. He wasn't just defined by his actions anymore, he was defined by his willingness to change. The letter from Michael Jordan was introduced into the case as evidence of Marcus's efforts to change. It wasn't the only factor, but it was an important one. The judge listened carefully, his expression unreadable as Marcus's words filled the courtroom. This wasn't just about Michael Jordan's celebrity, it was about the real, human connection between an idol and a man who had been lost. The letter had served as a catalyst, but it was Marcus's journey that truly mattered. As the trial continued, Rachel's arguments grew stronger. She presented the evidence of Marcus's transformation, and she urged the judge to consider the man standing before him, not just the man who had been sentenced all those years ago. She spoke about second chances, about the power of rehabilitation, and about the importance of offering people the opportunity to prove that they could be more than their past mistakes. She didn't expect Marcus to walk out of that courtroom a free man. What she wanted, what they both wanted, was a chance for Marcus to continue on the path he had started, a chance to show that he could make a positive impact on the world, even from within the prison walls. The courtroom was tense as the trial came to an end. Marcus's fate was still in the hands of the judge, but for the first time in a long while, Marcus didn't feel the weight of inevitability bearing down on him. The letter from Michael Jordan had opened a door, and now it was up to Marcus to prove that he was capable of walking through it. Whether or not the judge would grant him that chance, Marcus knew that he had already won something far more important, a chance to rewrite the story of his life, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever believed in the possibility of change. The day of the verdict arrived quietly, a heavy silence hanging over the prison. Marcus sat in his cell, his eyes fixed on the letter from Michael Jordan, which had been tucked in his pocket for the last few days. The letter had done more than give him hope, it had given him something to hold onto in a place where hope often felt scarce. He wasn't the same man who had first entered these prison gates, he wasn't the same man who had made those fateful decisions years ago. He was different now, and the world was going to see it. He had done everything he could to prove that he was worthy of another chance. Outside his cell, Rachel paced nervously. She had been in courtrooms countless times, but this one felt different. There was more on the line than just legal arguments and precedents. There was Marcus's life, a life that had been shaped by his past mistakes but was now being slowly remade by his willingness to change. The letter from Michael Jordan had been a catalyst, yes, but Rachel knew that the real work had been done by Marcus himself. It was his determination, his choice to embrace his flaws and begin the long process of redemption, that had made all the difference. Rachel had spent countless hours preparing for this day, but no matter how much preparation had gone into the case, there was a weight she couldn't escape. The outcome wasn't guaranteed, and even though Marcus had made tremendous strides, she knew that the law didn't always account for personal growth. The legal system, in its cold objectivity, didn't always allow room for second chances, especially for someone like Marcus, someone whose actions had been so severe. But Rachel believed in the power of transformation. She believed in Marcus, and she believed that he deserved the chance to continue the work he had started. As the morning dragged on, Marcus tried to focus on the present. He had already said everything he needed to say in court. His testimony had been honest, raw, and vulnerable. He had laid his soul bare for all to see, and there was nothing more he could do now but wait. The uncertainty was maddening, but there was also a quiet strength in knowing that he had done everything in his power to show that he wasn't the same person he had been. In the courtroom, the judge had asked for a recess to deliberate on the case, and now, the waiting felt unbearable. The defense had presented Marcus's case with everything they had, his transformation, the support from the rehabilitation programs, the impact of the letter from Michael Jordan, and the undeniable evidence that Marcus had taken full responsibility for his actions and had worked tirelessly to better himself. The prosecution, of course, had painted a very different picture. They hadn't ignored the personal growth Marcus had undergone, but they had argued that his crimes, the severity of his actions, couldn't be dismissed so easily. For them, Marcus's redemption wasn't enough to erase the damage he had caused. In their eyes, he was still a threat, still a man who had proven his capacity for violence, no matter how much he had changed in prison. For them, justice meant punishment, there was no room for second chances. The weight of that argument had been hard to ignore. Marcus had expected this. The system had never been kind to people like him, people who had been written off, people who had been judged by their worst actions rather than their potential for change. And yet, The letter from Michael Jordan had shifted something in him. It had given him the courage to stand up and fight for his future, to not accept the narrative that had been written for him long ago. He had spent too much of his life being defined by his mistakes. This was his chance to rewrite his story. As the hours passed, Marcus's thoughts drifted back to his family. They had always stood by him, even when it seemed like there was no hope left. They had never given up on him, even when he had given up on himself. His mother, in particular, had always believed in him, had always reminded him that his worth wasn't tied to the worst thing he had done. She was the first person he called when he received Michael's letter, the first person he shared his hopes with. She had always been his biggest supporter, and now, in the silence of his cell, he could almost hear her voice in his head, telling him to stay strong, to keep fighting. Rachel finally received the call to return to the courtroom. She could feel her heart racing as she made her way down the hallway. She wasn't nervous about the case. She knew she had done everything in her power to present Marcus's story. What worried her was the uncertainty. There was always the possibility that the judge would not be moved by the arguments, that the weight of Marcus's past would be too great to overcome. But she couldn't afford to think that way. She had to believe that the work Marcus had done, the person he had become, was enough. She had to believe that the system could see beyond the mistakes of the past and give Marcus the chance to continue his journey of change. When Rachel entered the courtroom, the judge was already seated, and Marcus stood beside her. The tension in the room was palpable. Everyone was waiting for the final decision, for the moment when the fate of a man who had fought so hard for redemption would be decided. The judge cleared his throat, and the room went silent. For a moment, it seemed like time stood still. "Mr. Smith," the judge began, his voice calm and measured. "The court has reviewed the arguments presented, as well as the evidence of your rehabilitation and personal growth. We recognize that you have made significant strides in changing the trajectory of your life. However, the nature of your past actions cannot be ignored. Justice must account for both the harm caused and the potential for growth." Marcus's heart pounded in his chest. Rachel stood quietly beside him, her eyes locked on the judge, waiting for the final ruling. "The court finds that while your actions were undeniably severe, your transformation cannot be overlooked," the judge continued. "The letter you received from Michael Jordan has clearly had a profound impact on your mindset, and we acknowledge the strides you have made in taking responsibility for your actions. With that in mind, the court is willing to grant you a second chance. You will be eligible for parole after serving an additional 5 years, during which time your continued progress will be monitored." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. For a moment, Marcus could barely breathe. A second chance, he had gotten a second chance. His heart swelled with emotion as he realized that the years of hard work, the transformation he had undergone, had paid off. He had been given an opportunity to continue his journey, to prove that he was not the man he had once been. It wasn't freedom, but it was hope. And in that moment, it was enough. Rachel squeezed his hand as they stood together, a shared sense of relief washing over them both. Marcus had a future now, a future he could shape, a future where redemption was no longer just a dream, but a reality. He had done what he thought was impossible. He had earned the right to live a life beyond his past, and he was determined to make the most of it. As they left the courtroom, Marcus felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He wasn't free, but he was no longer a man defined by his mistakes. He was someone who had been given a chance to rewrite his story, to build a future that would honor the lessons he had learned. And in that future, Michael Jordan's letter would always remain a reminder that even in the darkest of places, there was always the possibility of light. The morning after the verdict, Marcus sat in his cell, his mind racing. The judge's words still echoed in his head, eligible for parole after 5 more years, with a future still uncertain but undeniably different from the one he had walked into the courtroom with. 5 more years. It wasn't freedom, but it was something. It was a glimmer of hope, a chance to prove himself in a way he hadn't thought possible. His transformation was real, and now the system was giving him the opportunity to prove it to the world. He wasn't just a prisoner anymore. He was someone with a future. The weight of the verdict hadn't fully sunk in, but there was no denying that this was a pivotal moment. For the first time in years, Marcus allowed himself to feel something other than resignation or guilt. He felt proud, a feeling he hadn't experienced in so long. Michael's letter, his encouragement, had given him the first spark of belief in himself that he'd ever truly felt. And now, that belief was being recognized, not just by his own heart, but by the very system that had condemned him. Rachel Green had been there throughout it all. As Marcus sat quietly in his cell, she sat at her desk, reviewing the case files. She knew that this wasn't just a victory in the courtroom, this was a victory for Marcus's future. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There were still hurdles to overcome, still battles to fight. But she knew that Marcus now had the opportunity to walk a different path, one that was not defined by the mistakes of his past, but by the man he was becoming. Rachel had seen this moment coming, but even she couldn't have predicted the weight it would carry. For so many years, Marcus had been a prisoner in every sense of the word. He had been imprisoned not just by his actions but by the belief that he was beyond redemption. And yet, here he was, standing on the precipice of a second chance. Michael Jordan's letter, while seemingly a simple act of kindness, had opened a door for Marcus, one that allowed him to see the possibility of redemption. Rachel knew it wasn't just about the letter anymore. It was about everything Marcus had done since then, the work he'd put into bettering himself, the dedication he had shown to change, and the quiet strength that had been evident every time she had spoken with him. That morning, Marcus received the news that he would be transferred to a lower security facility where he could begin the next phase of his parole process. It wasn't freedom, but it was progress. The transition from death row to a lower security prison was symbolic. It meant he had earned the trust of the authorities. It meant that his transformation wasn't just a personal one, it was one that had been recognized by the people who had once seen him as a danger to society. He wasn't just another number anymore. He was Marcus Smith, a man who had made mistakes but was now working toward redemption. The other inmates had heard the news. Some congratulated him, others remained quiet, unsure of how to respond. But there was a noticeable change in the air, a shift that had occurred not because of the parole ruling, but because of Marcus's actions. He wasn't the same man who had come to prison all those years ago, and his transformation had rippled through the prison in ways that weren't immediately visible. For some, Marcus had become a symbol of hope, proof that change was possible, that people could grow even in the most unforgiving places. For others, he was a reminder of what they could never have, a chance at redemption that they had let slip through their fingers long ago. Carl, the older inmate who had once doubted Marcus's ability to change, came up to him that morning. The two had shared a complicated relationship over the years. Carl had been skeptical of Marcus's transformation, believing that a man like him, convicted of such serious crimes, could never truly change. But now, after months of watching Marcus's growth, Carl had come to see something different. "You did it, man," Carl said, his gruff voice breaking the silence. "I didn't think you could, but you did. You actually did it." Marcus smiled, feeling the weight of Carl's words. It wasn't just about the legal victory, it was about the respect he had earned from the men around him, men who had seen him at his lowest and now saw him fighting for something greater. "Thanks, Carl," Marcus said, his voice steady. "I couldn't have done it without believing it was possible." Carl nodded, his eyes softening for a moment. "Keep it up, Marcus. You're on the right path." The words meant more than Marcus could explain. They were more than just approval from a fellow inmate. They were an acknowledgement of the change he had fought for, an understanding that he had proven something not just to the system, but to the people around him. As Marcus prepared for the move to the new facility, Rachel called to check in, eager to hear about the next steps. She knew that this new chapter in Marcus's life wouldn't be easy, but she also knew that it was a necessary step toward the final phase of his journey. With parole on the horizon, Marcus would need to prove that his transformation was more than just a momentary change, it had to be a lasting one. The road ahead was still filled with uncertainty, but Rachel was confident that Marcus had what it took to continue fighting for his freedom and his future. "Marcus," Rachel said over the phone, "this is the beginning of a new chapter for you. You've worked hard to get here, and now you just have to keep pushing forward. This is a real chance." Marcus smiled, his heart light for the first time in years. I'm ready, Rachel. I've got this. It wasn't just a move to a new facility that excited him, it was the chance to continue proving to himself that he wasn't the same man who had walked into this system years ago. He wasn't perfect, and he knew the challenges would continue, but for the first time, he felt like he was in control of his future. He had learned the hard way that redemption wasn't something handed out easily. It had to be earned, every single day. As he walked out of his old cell, the door closing behind him, Marcus felt a strange sense of freedom. The physical barriers of the prison were still there, but in his heart, he had already broken free. The letter from Michael Jordan had been the spark, but the fire of his transformation had come from within. Now, as he stepped into the next phase of his life, he was ready to embrace the future, whatever it might bring. This was no longer about escaping the past. It was about building a future that he could be proud of, one step at a time. And Marcus knew that with each step, he was becoming the man he had always hoped to be, the man Michael Jordan had inspired him to become. Marcus sat on the edge of his cot in the new facility, a place far different from the isolation of death row where he had spent most of his time. The change was palpable. Not just the physical difference, the brighter lights, the smaller, more open cell, but the mental shift that had occurred since he had received Michael Jordan's letter. The past few months had been a whirlwind of progress, self-reflection, and small victories that culminated in this moment. Yet, there was a gnawing feeling in the back of his mind, one that he couldn't ignore. The new facility was only the next step. The battle wasn't over. He had learned one thing in his years of incarceration: nothing in the system was ever easy, and nothing was ever truly final. The ruling was still a long way from guaranteeing his ultimate freedom. Parole was not a sure thing. His behavior could be judged as just a temporary shift, one brought on by a letter and not by genuine change. This thought sat heavy on Marcus, but it also spurred him to work even harder. Rachel had called earlier that day. Her voice, steady and supportive, had filled him with a sense of assurance. "You're in a new chapter now, Marcus. But this isn't the end. It's the beginning. Keep proving that you're capable of more." Her words were more than just encouragement, they were a reminder of the trust she had placed in him. She had fought for him, believed in him when no one else had, and now he couldn't afford to let her down. He was on a schedule now. Every day was mapped out for him, and while there was a level of freedom in this new place, it wasn't without its constraints. He had to stay focused. The men in this facility were different. Some were hardened criminals with long sentences, others were like him, working toward redemption. Marcus had heard many stories in the common areas and the rec yards, some full of regret, others full of anger. He often wondered if he could have been like them if not for that one moment, that letter that had awakened something in him. He had seen firsthand that change wasn't automatic, it was something you had to choose, over and over again. As Marcus worked through his daily routine, he found himself more introspective. The small victories were starting to add up, but the weight of the past still clung to him. He found solace in the reading programs and rehabilitation efforts. But his thoughts often drifted back to his family, his mother, his sisters, people who had stood by him even when it was easier to walk away. His thoughts also lingered on the men in this new facility who had already resigned themselves to the belief that there was no escape from the lives they had created. They seemed distant, disconnected, uninterested in the possibility of change. Marcus knew better than anyone how tempting it was to give up and let the system consume you. But he had chosen differently. The letter from Michael Jordan had been the catalyst for a new perspective. It wasn't the kind of letter that just made you feel good for a moment. It was the kind that demanded action. Michael's words had done something for Marcus that even years of legal battles had failed to do. They had given him permission to hope, to believe in something bigger than himself. That was the real gift. The letter was not about pity or charity. It was about recognizing a potential for growth, even in a place like this. Marcus had seen the change in the other inmates, too. Some were inspired by his transformation, watching how he was handling his parole and rehabilitation efforts. They saw him reading more, participating in programs, and talking openly about his past mistakes. But others remained skeptical. Some mocked his attempts at change, dismissing them as temporary, born out of the fact that he had been given special attention. Marcus couldn't change their minds, but he didn't care about their judgment. He wasn't here for anyone else. He was here for himself. He knew that if he allowed their negativity to affect him, it would only delay the progress he had worked so hard for. Every week, Marcus attended a support group within the facility. It was a place for inmates to talk openly about their past, their regrets, and their efforts to change. It was difficult at first to be so open about the pain he had caused others, but over time, he found strength in the shared stories of the other men. There was a bond formed through shared experience, something he hadn't realized he'd needed. The support group wasn't about making excuses for the past, it was about acknowledging the damage and the consequences, but also about learning how to move forward. Marcus found himself taking on a leadership role in the group, listening to the others, offering support when he could. It felt good to help others, just as he had once been helped by Michael's letter. Still, there were days when the darkness crept in. It wasn't about the facility or the inmates, it was the remnants of his past that occasionally surfaced. Some nights, he would lie awake, thinking about the choices he had made, the people he had hurt. But as much as the guilt lingered, so did the resolve to be better. He had learned that it was okay to feel regret, but it wasn't okay to let it define him. That was the difference between the man he had been and the man he was becoming. As the months passed, Marcus's life began to take shape in ways he hadn't imagined. His parole hearing wasn't until the following year, but every step he took was building toward that moment. Rachel continued to fight for him, using every bit of evidence from his rehabilitation and the positive reports from the facility to build his case. She called regularly to check in on his progress, keeping him focused on the future and reminding him that there was still work to do. Marcus understood that the next few years would be crucial. He couldn't afford to slip back into old patterns, to lose sight of the goal. The other inmates continued to watch him, some with admiration, others with skepticism. But Marcus was no longer concerned with their opinions. He had learned that the only judgment that mattered was his own. Every day, he asked himself, "Am I better today than I was yesterday?" It was a small question, but it was one that kept him grounded, one that gave him the motivation to keep moving forward. Marcus's transformation had not been easy, but it had been necessary. The letter from Michael Jordan had started a journey of self-discovery, of healing, and of redemption. The road was far from over, but it was one that Marcus was willing to walk, no matter how long it took. And as the weeks turned into months, Marcus realized something important. He wasn't trying to prove anything to the world. He was trying to prove something to himself. He had been given a second chance, and it was up to him to make the most of it. In the quiet moments of his day, when he was alone in his cell, Marcus would often think back to the letter. Michael's words still held power, still pushed him forward. He had learned that change didn't come from external validation, it came from within. And as he continued to work on his redemption, he knew that every choice he made would bring him closer to the person he was meant to be. As the months passed, Marcus's life began to feel like a constant process of proving himself, not to others, but to himself. The weight of his past would never truly go away, but he had learned how to live with it, to use it as fuel rather than a burden. The time at the new facility had been a blessing. He wasn't just existing anymore, he was building something. Every day, every decision felt like a piece of the puzzle falling into place. Rachel continued to work tirelessly behind the scenes. She had seen the transformation in Marcus, and now her task was to ensure that everyone else saw it too. His parole hearing was approaching, and it was the moment of truth. It wasn't just about whether the system would allow him to walk free, it was about whether the change he had made in his life was enough to be recognized. The parole board wasn't going to be swayed by sentimentality or Michael Jordan's letter. Marcus knew that. He had spent too many years in the system to believe that anything was that simple. But what he had was something most inmates didn't, a genuine will to change, a documented history of his transformation, and the evidence of his commitment to making amends. The letter had been the catalyst, but it was the work he had put in that mattered now. Marcus's routine in the facility had become his lifeline. Every day, he spent time in the library, reading books on personal development, history, philosophy, anything that helped him grow. He had started journaling, keeping track of his thoughts and feelings. The pages weren't filled with excuses or regrets, but with reflections on how he could be better, how he could become the person he was capable of being. He had begun taking personal development classes, focused on skills that would help him reintegrate into society when the time came. Marcus had spent so many years feeling like he had been forgotten by the world. Now, he was actively trying to change that. He continued to lead support groups, something that had grown into one of the most fulfilling parts of his life. The group wasn't just a space for inmates to talk about their pasts, it had become a community, a place where men who had made mistakes could share their journeys toward redemption. In those meetings, Marcus was more than just a leader, he was a listener. He shared his own story but also listened intently to others, offering advice when asked, and learning from their experiences. He had always been taught that strength came from doing, from showing up, from proving your worth. But now, he understood that strength also came from vulnerability, from being open about the pain of the past and acknowledging it. He had learned how to confront the hard truths about himself, and it was through that honesty that he had found real peace. At night, when the cell block quieted down and the prison settled into its routine, Marcus would lie in his bed and think about the life he could have had. The life he thought he was destined for before his choices had derailed it. He thought about his family, his mother, who had always been his biggest supporter, and his sisters, who had stuck by him even when it would have been easier to turn away. They were the reason he fought so hard to change. The love they had given him was a gift that he wasn't going to waste. His parole hearing was finally upon him. Marcus dressed carefully, making sure everything was in place. He had been in front of panels before, in his earlier days of incarceration, but this time felt different. It wasn't just about presenting a case, it was about showing the people in that room who he was now, the man who had changed, who had worked for redemption, not for a second chance at freedom, but because he had realized that freedom was something he could achieve from within. Rachel arrived just before the hearing started, her presence a small comfort in the midst of the tension that filled Marcus's chest. She smiled at him as they exchanged a few words, reminding him to stay focused, to remember why he was there. It wasn't to apologize again for what he had done. It wasn't to beg for mercy. It was to show them that he had grown, that he had taken responsibility, and that he was more than just his past. The room was cold and impersonal, filled with a group of individuals who had heard countless cases like Marcus's. They were the ones who would decide his fate. They would determine whether his transformation was real or just a momentary shift, something brought on by the novelty of his celebrity connection. Marcus sat silently, waiting for his turn to speak. He had rehearsed everything he needed to say, but in this moment, he knew that it wasn't just about the words, it was about the sincerity behind them. He had learned that change wasn't just about saying the right things, it was about embodying them, living them every day. The panel members began their questioning, their faces stern and professional. One of them, a woman with glasses who had been silent until now, looked directly at Marcus. "Mr. Smith," she began, "you've had a significant amount of time to reflect on your actions. We've seen your participation in rehabilitation programs. But let me ask you, why do you believe that you're different now than you were when you first entered this system?" Marcus took a deep breath, his hands resting on the table in front of him. He had asked himself that question countless times. But now, he knew the answer. "I believe I'm different because I'm finally honest with myself," he said, his voice steady. "For years, I tried to hide from the person I was, the choices I made. But I've realized that I can't change my past, but I can change who I am right now. Every day, I get up and I try to be better than the person I was yesterday. I've worked to become someone who takes responsibility for his actions. I'm not the same man who walked into this system all those years ago. I've learned to value my life, to value the people who believe in me." The woman nodded, taking notes. Another panel member spoke up, asking him about the specifics of his rehabilitation and the programs he had been a part of. Marcus answered truthfully, recounting the ways he had grown, how he had taken part in education programs, had learned new skills, and had mentored younger inmates who had struggled with their own paths. He spoke about the importance of his journey not just for himself but for others around him, how his transformation had inspired some of the men in the facility to take responsibility for their own actions. The questions continued, each one digging deeper into Marcus's character. But with each answer, Marcus felt more and more certain that he was on the right path. He wasn't perfect, and he didn't expect them to see him as flawless. But he had made real progress, and for the first time, he could say that with conviction. He wasn't asking for forgiveness anymore. He was asking for a chance to prove that he had changed, that he was worthy of being part of the world outside these walls. Finally, the panel nodded and informed him that they would deliberate. The waiting was excruciating, but Marcus stayed composed. This was a moment that had taken years to arrive, and whether the decision was in his favor or not, he had already taken the first step toward becoming the man he knew he could be. The decision would come, and it would shape his future. But Marcus no longer feared the unknown. He had found peace in his journey, regardless of the outcome. When the panel returned, the words that followed were both expected and unexpected. We believe that you have shown genuine remorse and have worked hard to transform your life. We are granting you parole, effective immediately. Marcus's heart stopped for a moment, and then the room around him seemed to clear. He had done it. He had earned it. And now, it was up to him to live up to the second chance he had been given. The long road ahead was filled with uncertainty, but he was ready. He had fought for this moment, and now, it was his to claim. Marcus stepped out of the courtroom and into the waiting room, his heart pounding in his chest. The parole board's decision had come quickly, but it felt like a lifetime had passed while he waited for their judgment. When the verdict came, it wasn't a moment of pure triumph, nor was it the final, sweeping conclusion to the story of his life. It was just a beginning. But it was a beginning that he had earned, a second chance that seemed impossible years ago. The panel had been convinced. They had seen the man Marcus had become, not just the man he was when he walked into the system. The parole board had noted his rehabilitation, his transformation from a prisoner shackled by his past to a man who had embraced the chance to change. His years of hard work, both personal and in the programs available to him, had finally led to this moment. They had seen that Marcus was no longer a product of his worst decisions. He had become someone with a purpose, someone who understood the weight of responsibility. And they had decided that he deserved a chance to prove it in the world beyond the walls of the prison. As the guards escorted him back to his cell to collect his things, Marcus thought about the life that had brought him to this point. He had never envisioned this as the future he would have. In his darkest days, he'd convinced himself that there was no coming back, that he was defined by his worst choices, and that the person he once was would never allow him to have a future worth living. But the decision that had just been made wasn't just a legal victory, it was the culmination of a long and painful journey, one that had started with his own desire to change, and had been solidified by the support he had received along the way, including Michael Jordan's unexpected gesture. It wasn't lost on him that his story wasn't just his own. The letter from Michael had sparked something that he never thought possible. At the time, he didn't expect that a simple piece of mail could change the course of his life. But Michael Jordan had done something no one else had. He had acknowledged Marcus not just as a prisoner, but as a man, a person worthy of redemption. That simple letter had given Marcus the courage to start living up to the person he could be, and now, here he was, walking out of the prison doors, a free man, ready to face the world that had once seemed so distant. In the few days that followed, Marcus was processed, given the necessary paperwork, and released into the world. He didn't know exactly what awaited him, but he wasn't afraid. For the first time in years, Marcus felt the weight of the past lifting. He wasn't running from who he was anymore. He had accepted his mistakes, made amends where he could, and had worked to better himself in ways that had changed him fundamentally. The hard work was far from over, but the road ahead felt more like a path of opportunity than one of regret. Rachel called him the night after his release, a quiet, heartfelt conversation that left Marcus feeling both grounded and inspired. She congratulated him, but she also reminded him that this wasn't the end of the journey. "You've come a long way, Marcus. But the real work starts now," she said. "Keep proving them wrong. Keep proving yourself right. Marcus promised that he would. It wasn't about the system anymore, it was about continuing the work he'd started. He couldn't change his past, but he could control his future. He would live in a way that honored the chance he had been given. As the phone call ended, Marcus found himself standing outside the gates of the facility, a free man, ready to take on a world that he had left behind so long ago. It was overwhelming. The world on the other side of the prison was bustling, filled with people moving in all directions, each caught in their own lives. Marcus had been away from this for so long that it felt like stepping into a dream. The freedom was intoxicating, but it also scared him. He didn't know where to go, or what to do next. But he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't go back to the person he had been. He spent the first few days reconnecting with his family. His mother, always his greatest champion, had waited years for this moment. She had never given up on him, even when he had given up on himself. She hugged him tightly when she saw him for the first time as a free man. Her joy was a mixture of relief and pride, but also of a deep understanding that this was not a simple celebration. This was the beginning of something new, and they both knew the challenges would be many. His sisters had been there, too, supporting him every step of the way, offering encouragement, and helping him adjust to the new life he was trying to build. But even with all of that support, Marcus understood that no one else could walk this journey for him. The next step was finding work. He didn't want to take the easy way out, to let the system or his criminal record define him. He applied to local organizations and began volunteering at a community center, helping young men who found themselves in situations similar to his. He had made a promise to himself when he had first received Michael's letter that he wouldn't just live for himself, but for the others who needed hope. He wanted to be someone they could look to, someone who had found a way out of the darkness. Over the next few months, Marcus worked hard to rebuild his life. It wasn't easy. There were moments when he doubted himself, when the weight of his past seemed to creep in. But he kept moving forward, taking each day as a new opportunity to prove that he was more than just the mistakes of his past. He attended counseling, kept up with his support groups, and focused on his work. He learned that redemption wasn't just about getting out of prison, it was about making good on the chance he had been given. Through it all, the letter from Michael Jordan remained a symbol of the potential that still lived in him. Every time he faced a challenge or doubted his progress, he would pull out the letter and read it again. Michael's words were not a get-out-of-jail-free card, but a reminder that change was possible, no matter how far gone you might feel. The letter was a message of hope, one that had changed the trajectory of Marcus's life. In time, Marcus rebuilt his relationships with his family, gained stability in his work, and found his place in the world. His past would always be with him, but it no longer controlled him. He wasn't perfect, he didn't expect to be, but he was a man who had made peace with his mistakes and was doing everything he could to live up to the chance he had been given. Years later, as Marcus stood in front of a group of young men at the community center, speaking about his own journey, he knew that this was what he was meant to do. He had come full circle. The letter from Michael Jordan had been the spark, but Marcus had been the one to do the work. And now, as he looked at the faces of the young men in the room, he realized that his story, once marked by failure, had become a testament to the possibility of change. And that, more than anything else, was his true redemption.